The story of how one of the world's most prestigious universities became a breeding ground for Soviet espionage remains among the most consequential intelligence failures in Western history. Cambridge University, that ancient seat of learning where Isaac Newton once pondered gravity, and where the sons of Britain's elite had been groomed for centuries to govern an empire, produced in the 1930s a cadre of young men who would betray their country with a conviction that shook the foundations of British intelligence for generations. This is not a tale of crude mercenaries selling secrets for cash, but rather of ideological converts who believed they were serving a higher cause. Men who walked the corridors of power while secretly answering to Moscow, and whose treachery would cost countless lives and reshape the entire landscape of Cold War espionage. To understand how Cambridge became such fertile ground for Soviet recruitment, we must first grasp the unique atmosphere of Britain in the early 1930s. The Great Depression had shattered the illusion of capitalist stability. Unemployment in Britain reached nearly 3 million by 1932. The old certainties of the Victorian and Edwardian eras lay in ruins, discredited by the carnage of the First World War and the economic catastrophe that followed. Meanwhile, across Europe, fascism was rising. Mussolini had already seized power in Italy, and in January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. To many young intellectuals at Cambridge, the democratic governments of the West seemed paralyzed, unable to confront the fascist threat or address the suffering of millions. The Soviet Union, by contrast, appeared to offer a bold alternative. Soviet propaganda painted a picture of a workers' paradise where unemployment had been eliminated, where industrialization was proceeding at breakneck speed under the 5-year plans, and where a new society was being built on principles of equality and scientific rationality. Cambridge in this era was not merely a university, but an entire social ecosystem with its own rituals, societies, and hierarchies. The most elite students belonged to the Apostles, a secret discussion society founded in 1820 that had counted Bertrand Russell, John Maynard Keynes, and other luminaries among its members. It was in these rarefied circles, in rooms overlooking ancient courtyards, over sherry and intense philosophical debates, that the foundations of betrayal were laid. The young men who would become the Cambridge Five were products of privilege, educated at the finest schools, fluent in multiple languages, and destined by birth and education for positions of influence. Yet, they shared a contempt for the system that had produced them and a burning conviction that history was on the side of communism. The recruitment operation that would ensnare these men was orchestrated with remarkable patience and sophistication by Soviet intelligence. The key figure in this operation was Arnold Deutsch, an Austrian who worked for the NKVD, the Soviet secret police that preceded the KGB. Deutsch arrived in Britain in 1934 undercover as a university lecturer. He was no crude handler, but rather an intellectual himself, holding a doctorate in chemistry and well-versed in psychology. Deutsch understood that recruiting these privileged Cambridge men required not threats or money, but rather ideological persuasion and the appeal of joining an elite clandestine brotherhood serving the cause of world revolution. The NKVD had learned from earlier, cruder attempts at espionage in the West. They now sought not working-class sympathizers who might be easily detected, but rather moles who could burrow deep into the establishment, who belonged there by right of birth and education, and who could remain in place for decades. The first and perhaps most damaging of the Cambridge spies was Harold Adrian Russell Philby, known always as Kim. Born in 1812 in Ambala, India, where his father served as a colonial administrator, Philby arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1929. He was charming, articulate, and blessed with the easy confidence of his class. At Cambridge, he fell under the influence of Maurice Dobb, an openly Marxist economics lecturer, and became involved with the Cambridge Socialist Society. In 1933, Philby traveled to Vienna, ostensibly to improve his German, but in reality to work with communist organizations, helping socialists flee from the increasingly fascist Austrian government. It was in Vienna that Philby met Litzi Friedmann, a communist activist whom he married in February 1934, partly to enable her escape from Austria. This marriage brought Philby directly into the orbit of Soviet intelligence, as Friedmann had existing connections to NKVD networks. Upon returning to London, Philby was contacted by Deutsch and formally recruited to Soviet intelligence in June 1934. The instructions Deutsch gave him reveal the long-term nature of Soviet planning. Philby was told to distance himself publicly from communist activities, to cultivate a conventional, even right-wing political image, and to seek employment in journalism or government service, where he might eventually access classified information. Philby followed these instructions with disciplined precision. He joined the Anglo-German Fellowship, a pro-Nazi organization providing himself with perfect cover. He became a journalist, reporting from Spain during the Civil War from the Franco side, even receiving a medal from the fascist government. All the while, he was feeding information to Moscow and positioning himself for recruitment into British intelligence. The second member of what would become known as the Cambridge Five was Donald Maclean. Born in 1913 to a Liberal Member of Parliament, Maclean seemed destined for distinguished public service. He arrived at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, in 1931, and quickly distinguished himself as a brilliant student of modern languages. Like Philby, Maclean was radicalized by the political turmoil of the early 30s and became involved with socialist groups at Cambridge. He was recruited by Deutsch in 1934, around the same time as Philby. Maclean's target was even more ambitious than Philby's. He sat for the Foreign Office examinations in 1935 and passed with flying colors, entering the British diplomatic service that same year. From his very first day as a diplomat, Maclean was a Soviet agent, positioned to access the most sensitive communications between Britain and its allies. Guy Burgess represents perhaps the most flamboyant and unlikely of the Cambridge spies. Born in 1911, Burgess attended Eton and then Trinity College, Cambridge, where he became a member of the Apostles. Burgess was openly homosexual at a time when such orientation was not merely taboo, but criminal in Britain, a fact that should have disqualified him from sensitive government work, but somehow never did. He was recruited by Deutsch in 1934 or 35, though Burgess had been a committed communist for some time before formal recruitment. Unlike Philby and Maclean, who carefully constructed conventional facades, Burgess remained outrageously unconventional, a heavy drinker and promiscuous socialite, whose very flamboyance seemed to deflect suspicion. He worked briefly for the BBC, then joined a section of British intelligence, all while maintaining his secret allegiance to Moscow. Anthony Blunt came from the most elevated social background of all the Cambridge spies. Born in 1907, he was a distant cousin of the Queen Mother. At Trinity College, Cambridge, where he studied mathematics and modern languages before becoming a fellow, Blunt was a leading figure in the Apostles and a prominent art historian. He was recruited by Deutsch in 1937. During the Second World War, Blunt served in MI5, Britain's domestic security service, where he had access to vast amounts of counterintelligence information, all of which he systematically passed to the Soviets. After the war, he became surveyor of the King's Pictures, later the Queen's Pictures, advising the royal family on their art collection while secretly remaining a Soviet agent. The fifth member of the ring, John Cairncross, was recruited slightly later, and operated somewhat independently of the others. Born in 1913 in Scotland, Cairncross came from a more modest background than his fellow spies, and perhaps felt he had more to prove. He arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1934, and was recruited by the NKVD in 1937. Cairncross worked at the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park during the war, where he had access to decrypted German communications, including intelligence about German military plans. The information he passed to Moscow included details of German preparations for Operation Citadel, the offensive at Kursk in 1943, intelligence that may have contributed to the Soviet victory in that crucial battle. The damage these 5 men inflicted on Western security interests over more than 2 decades is difficult to calculate fully even now. During the 1930s, they provided Moscow with detailed information about British foreign policy, internal political debates, and intelligence operations. When war broke out in September 1939, their value increased exponentially. After Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, making Britain and the USSR allies against Nazi Germany, the Cambridge spies could justify their treachery as serving the common cause. Yet, they continued their espionage long after the war ended and the Cold War began, when their actions constituted pure betrayal of their country in favor of a hostile power. Philby's penetration of British intelligence represents perhaps the most devastating achievement of Soviet espionage. In September 1940, he was recruited into the Secret Intelligence Service, commonly known as MI6. His recruitment was facilitated by Burgess, who recommended him. Throughout the war, Philby rose steadily through the ranks, proving himself a capable and dedicated officer. By 1944, he was head of Section 9, responsible for anti-Soviet counterintelligence. The irony was almost too perfect. The man responsible for protecting Britain from Soviet espionage was himself a Soviet spy. Philby used his position to identify British agents operating against the Soviet Union and to betray them to Moscow. After the war, he continued his ascent, and in 1949 he was posted to Washington as the MI6 liaison to the CIA and FBI, giving him access to the most sensitive Anglo-American intelligence operations of the early Cold War. Maclean's position in the Foreign Office proved equally valuable to Moscow. By 1938, he was serving in the British Embassy in Paris. After the fall of France, he was evacuated to London, then posted to Washington in May 1944. In Washington, Maclean served as secretary of the Combined Policy Committee on Atomic Energy, which coordinated British, American, and Canadian nuclear weapons development. He thus had access to information about the Manhattan Project and early Anglo-American atomic policy. The intelligence he provided to Moscow during this period gave the Soviets crucial insights into Western nuclear capabilities and intentions during the critical early years of the atomic age. Maclean returned to London in September 1948 and, by 1950, was head of the American Department at the Foreign Office, responsible for all British policy toward the United States and for handling the most sensitive communications between London and Washington. The beginning of the end for the Cambridge spy ring came from an unexpected direction: American signals intelligence. The Venona Project, begun in February 1943, was a top-secret effort by U.S. Army cryptographers to decrypt Soviet diplomatic and intelligence communications. The work was painstaking and took years, but by 1946, American codebreakers began achieving their first successes in reading NKVD messages from the war years. These decrypts revealed the existence of Soviet spies with code names like Homer, Stanley, and Hicks operating at high levels within the British government. The problem was identifying which individuals corresponded to which code names. By 1950, American and British counterintelligence had narrowed the search for the spy codenamed Homer, to a small group of Foreign Office officials who had served in Washington during the war and had access to atomic intelligence. McLean was among the suspects. The investigation proceeded slowly, hampered by the need to protect the Venona secret and by the difficulty of believing that someone of McLean's background could be a traitor. Meanwhile, Philby, in his position in Washington, was kept informed of the investigation's progress and realized that McLean was in imminent danger of exposure. Philby alerted Moscow through his handlers, and the decision was made to exfiltrate McLean before he could be arrested and interrogated. The task of warning McLean fell to Burgess, who was conveniently in Washington at the time, living in Philby's house. In May 1951, Burgess returned to London under instructions from Moscow to arrange McLean's escape. On the evening of May 25, 1951, which happened to be McLean's 38th birthday, Burgess drove McLean to Southampton, where they boarded a ferry to France. From France, they made their way through Europe with the assistance of Soviet intelligence, eventually reaching Moscow. Their disappearance caused an immediate sensation. 2 British diplomats had vanished without trace, and within days, intelligence officials realized they had fled to the Soviet Union. The scandal was enormous, raising fundamental questions about security vetting and the reliability of the British establishment. Burgess's decision to flee with McLean, rather than simply facilitating McLean's escape and remaining in place, has never been fully explained. It may have been a panic decision, or Burgess may have concluded that his association with McLean would inevitably expose him. Whatever the reason, his defection had catastrophic consequences for Philby. Burgess and Philby were known associates. Burgess had lived in Philby's Washington home. The connection was too obvious to ignore. Philby was recalled to London in June 1951 and subjected to intensive interrogation. He denied everything, admitting only that he had been a communist sympathizer in the 1930s, a youthful indiscretion he claimed to have long since outgrown. Despite strong suspicions, MI6 could not prove Philby's guilt. The Venona decrypts could not be used as evidence without revealing the source, and Philby was far too skilled an intelligence officer to have left other traces. He was forced to resign from MI6 in July 1951, but he was not prosecuted. For the next 12 years, Philby lived in a kind of limbo, officially unemployed by MI6, but working as a journalist in Beirut and almost certainly still in contact with Soviet intelligence. In London, the debate over his guilt continued. Some in MI6 remained convinced of his treachery, while others believed he had been unfairly scapegoated. In 1963, new evidence finally emerged that definitively proved Philby's guilt. Under renewed interrogation in Beirut, Philby initially made partial admissions, but before he could be brought back to London for further questioning, he disappeared. On January the 23rd, 1963, he boarded a Soviet freighter in Beirut and sailed to Moscow, where he would live for the remaining 25 years of his life, a hero of the Soviet Union, but an exile from the country of his birth. Blunt's exposure took even longer. He had confessed to MI5 in 1964 after being confronted with evidence from American intelligence sources, but he was granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation in identifying other Soviet agents. This arrangement remained secret for 15 years. It was not until November 1979 that Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher publicly revealed in Parliament that Blunt had been a Soviet spy. Blunt was stripped of his knighthood and lived his remaining years in disgrace, dying in 1983. Cairncross, the 5th member of the Ring, was identified and interrogated in the 1960s, but was never prosecuted. He lived in exile in France and Italy, returning to Britain only in his final years, dying in 1995. The question that haunts the Cambridge spy scandal is not merely how these men evaded detection for so long, but why they were able to penetrate British intelligence in the first place. Part of the answer lies in the class system that dominated Britain in the first half of the 20th century. The intelligence services, the Foreign Office, and other sensitive branches of government were staffed almost exclusively by products of elite public schools and Oxford or Cambridge. There was an assumption, largely unconscious, that men from this background were inherently trustworthy, that their breeding and education guaranteed their loyalty. Security vetting was minimal and focused primarily on checking for obvious vulnerabilities like financial problems or sexual indiscretions that might make someone susceptible to blackmail. The idea that someone might betray his country for ideological reasons out of genuine conviction that he was serving a higher cause was not taken seriously. This blindness was compounded by personal connections. The intelligence services operated like a gentleman's club, where recruitment often depended on personal recommendation. Philby was recruited to MI6 on the recommendation of someone who knew his father. Burgess recommended Philby. These old boy networks, which were supposed to ensure reliability, instead allowed Soviet agents to recommend each other and vouch for each other's loyalty. The damage the Cambridge Five inflicted extends beyond the specific secrets they betrayed. Devastating as those were, they compromised entire intelligence networks. Agents working for Britain in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were identified and arrested, many of them executed. Operations that had taken years to establish were rolled up overnight. The Albanian operation of the late 1940s and early 1950s, in which MI6 and the CIA attempted to infiltrate agents into communist Albania to foment resistance, was betrayed by Philby, leading to the capture and execution of dozens of Albanian émigrés who had been parachuted into their homeland. Philby's treachery in this operation alone cost at least 50 lives. Beyond these direct casualties, the Cambridge spies poisoned the relationship between British and American intelligence services. The CIA and FBI became deeply suspicious of their British counterparts, questioning whether MI6 and MI5 could be trusted with sensitive information. This suspicion persisted for decades and hampered intelligence cooperation at crucial moments during the Cold War. The Cambridge spy ring also had a profound psychological impact on Britain's intelligence establishment and on British society more broadly. The revelation that men from the most privileged backgrounds, educated at the finest institutions, trusted with the nation's most vital secrets, had betrayed their country shook confidence in the entire system. It called into question the assumptions on which British society was built. The idea that class and education created natural leaders who could be trusted to govern. The scandal contributed to a broader questioning of traditional authority that characterized Britain in the 1960s and 70s. It also led to a complete overhaul of security vetting procedures. The assumption that background alone guaranteed loyalty was abandoned in favor of more rigorous investigation of political beliefs, associations, and potential vulnerabilities. From Moscow's perspective, the Cambridge Five represented perhaps the greatest intelligence coup of the 20th century. For more than 2 decades, the NKVD and its successor, the KGB, had access to the highest levels of British intelligence and foreign policy, and through Britain's close relationship with the United States, to American secrets as well. The intelligence provided by these agents shaped Soviet policy during the Second World War and the early Cold War. Stalin knew from Maclean's reports exactly what Churchill and Roosevelt were discussing about the post-war world. Soviet negotiators at conferences like Yalta in February 1945 knew the Western position in advance because Maclean had provided it to them. During the early years of the Cold War, Moscow knew which of its operations had been compromised because Philby told them. The Cambridge spies gave the Soviet Union an incalculable advantage during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. Yet, the story of the Cambridge Five also reveals the limitations and costs of espionage. Despite all the intelligence these agents provided, the Soviet Union still lost the Cold War. Information, however valuable, is not the same as wisdom. Stalin often distrusted the intelligence provided by his own agents, suspecting disinformation or provocation. The information from Cambridge sometimes confirmed his paranoid worldview, convincing him that the West was plotting against the Soviet Union when, in fact, Western leaders were often divided and uncertain. The Cambridge spies also created a false sense of security in Moscow, a belief that Soviet intelligence had penetrated the West so thoroughly that any Western move could be anticipated and countered. This overconfidence may have contributed to Soviet miscalculations during the Cold War. For the spies themselves, their betrayal brought little satisfaction. Maclean and Burgess lived unhappily in Moscow, honored by the state, but isolated, alcoholic, and filled with regret. Burgess died in 1963, never having adjusted to Soviet life. Maclean survived until 1983, but his later years were marked by disillusionment with the Soviet system he had served. Philby adapted better than the others, learning Russian, marrying a Russian woman, and accepting his role as a Soviet hero. But even he admitted in private that he had not expected the Soviet Union to be as repressive and dysfunctional as it proved to be. Blunt, exposed and disgraced, spent his final years as a pariah. Cairncross lived in exile, his contributions to Soviet victory in the war unacknowledged in the West and barely recognized in the Soviet Union. The legacy of the Cambridge spy ring extends into the 21st century. It remains a touchstone in discussions of loyalty, ideology, and betrayal. The story has been told and retold in books, films, and television series, each generation finding new meanings in the tale of privileged young men who chose to betray their country. For some, they remain villains, traitors whose actions cost lives and endangered their nation. For others, they are more ambiguous figures, idealists who made a terrible choice in terrible times, who genuinely believed they were serving a higher cause even as they committed treason. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. They were intelligent men who made a catastrophic moral error, who convinced themselves that their superior understanding of history justified betraying their oaths and their colleagues, and who lived to see the ideology they had served revealed as deeply flawed. The Cambridge spy scandal also serves as an enduring reminder of the vulnerabilities inherent in any system of secrecy and trust. No security system can be perfect because all such systems ultimately depend on human beings, and human beings can be swayed by ideology, ambition, resentment, or conviction. The men who recruited the Cambridge Five understood this fundamental truth. They did not need to threaten or bribe. They simply needed to convince these young men that they were joining an elite serving the inevitable march of history. That conviction, once established, proved remarkably durable, surviving even the evidence of Stalin's purges, the Nazi-Soviet pact, and the repressive nature of the Soviet system. The Cambridge Five were not mindless dupes, but rather intelligent men who chose to see what they wanted to see and to ignore what contradicted their beliefs. In that sense, their story is not merely about espionage, but about the human capacity for self-deception in service of ideology, a capacity that remains as relevant today as it was in the 1930s when these men first pledged their allegiance to Moscow in the ancient courtyards of Cambridge.